Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to start off to say sorry I'm late. I was supposed to be here yesterday, but I didn't get a visa. I didn't realise I was supposed to have a visa. So I'm very glad to finally be here. I apologise for not being able to do what I was supposed to do yesterday. Thanks particularly to Lorena and Marcia and Eduardo, who pulled a lot of strings as far as I could see. But I had an enjoyable time. I went back to Santiago yesterday and into Chile and back to the airport and here. Very glad to be here. I got up early and went for a run at Ibirapura Park. So I'm starting to see what Brazil and Sao Paulo in particular is like. So I've got here in my presentation some photos from Australia. I took these from where I go for my summer holidays. So I'd like to invite you to Australia, and if you want to come, I'd take you around here. So feel very welcome to come if you want to. Firstly, I declare no conflict of interest, none that I'm not aware that I have. And I wanted to acknowledge what I have on this slide are the agencies and groups who've contributed to the mesothelioma registry at various times, not all of them still involved. And part of the presentation, I've got a few of the slides I've pinched from a presentation I gave a couple of years ago that someone from the registry had prepared, but most of them are new ones. Like Dario, in fact my presentation is a lot like Dario's. Some of the results look very similar and the structure is similar. So this is what I'm planning to go through. I'm going to give you a bit of a history of the various surveillance schemes we've had in Australia for mesothelioma, and then talk about what we've got in place now and give you some of the results depending on how much time we've got. Okay, so first to tell you about the history of mesothelioma surveillance. That's my kayak, by the way. Right, from 1980 to 1985, that's really when Australia started to focus on mesothelioma. And there was what was really a research program that was begun. And the aim of that was to collect information on all mesothelioma cases in the country. So that was the first time that it had been done. And it was called the Mesothelioma Program. And I'll give you a little bit more detail about that. And that finished in 1985, and from 1986 onwards till late in the 2000s, I'm not sure exactly when, was the Australian Mesothelioma Register. And that was run by the National Occupational Health and Safety Commission, which was the federal government statutory authority looking after health and safety. And I was working there through that period, and I was in fact head of the Mesothelioma Register for a few years, but it stopped by the time it closed down. And then in 2010 it was resurrected, not as the register but as the registry, and it's continued operating since then. It's funded by Safe Work Australia, which is the new name of the National Occupational Health and Safety Commission. And for the first 7 years, or up until early this year, it was managed by the New South Wales Cancer Institute, and just recently it's changed to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. I'm not sure what your Brazilian equivalent would be, but that's the federal government health department, but the part that deals with statistics on health. So the program, which is the first one that I mentioned, the detailed one, there was voluntary notification, but it was fairly formal, and a very detailed history was taken from all of the affected people, or if they were too ill or had died, from their relatives. And that exposure history was assessed by at least 2 experienced occupational hygienists, and tissue samples were obtained and looked at by a panel of 5 or 6 pathologists to confirm the diagnosis, and the wide range of publications that came out of that. The register which replaced the program, that was the one that started in 1986, that had formal notification, still voluntary, and came from a wide range of sources. We had a cancer registry that started operating in 1981 in Australia, so that was all cancers, but including mesothelioma. So that notified, but also pathology labs and hospitals and individual doctors and even patients could notify themselves. It only had a very short exposure history questionnaire. It was also assessed by 2 hygienists, but there wasn't a lot of information in that one. Only histologically confirmed cases were accepted, and there were a series of annual reports that came out from that. The reason that it closed down in the late 2000s is that we had new privacy laws that came into Australia in the early 2000s, and increasingly the people who were doing the notification were worried that legally they weren't allowed to do the notification. Now, I'm not sure that actually it was true that they weren't allowed, but they were worried, and particularly one of our states, we're like you, we're a federation, and one of our states just stopped reporting completely, which undermined the program being a national resource. So the register closed down for a couple of years, and then it was resurrected as the registry. So now I'm going to talk to you about the registry. So that's the one that's in operation now. It has all cases of mesothelioma that have been registered since the 1st of July 2010. And our cancer registry is very good for nearly all cancers and is certainly very good for mesothelioma. So I would expect this is 99.9% of all cases, presuming they were diagnosed correctly. It has incidence information and mortality information, so it follows people up to find out their cause of death. And it includes information on asbestos exposure for some of the cases, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. These are the stated aims of the mesothelioma register, so to monitor the incidence, to monitor the patterns of occupational and environmental exposure, to publicise that information, and to use this information to prevent mesothelioma in the future, particularly by using the exposure information to help inform government policy and practice. In terms of the data collection, most of the notifications come via the registry, the cancer registry, because there's mandatory reporting of all cases of cancer in Australia, including mesothelioma. And there's also a regular link to the AIHW's National Deaths Index, and that gives us information on mortality. The asbestos exposure information is obtained from the patients. At the moment, we don't get any from the relatives, which is a problem. The information comes from postal questionnaire and or telephone interview, and there's a detailed history taken on occupational and environmental exposures, not just asbestos, but focusing on asbestos. So in terms of looking at how we get the consent and other information for patients, this is a schematic diagram looking at the flow of information. I don't really like using a laser pointer, but I'll try. So the information here, this top rectangle, is the information from the state and territory registries. And they, on behalf of the registry, will contact the treating doctor and will ask them if they give permission for the patient to be contacted. And if they say no, then there's no more information obtained about the patient, so no exposure history. If they say yes, then the patient is contacted, and if they consent, they provide the exposure information. So two ways that might come. Everything comes via the everything comes from the state and territory notifications. Some people we just know that they had mesothelioma, but we don't have any information on their exposure. Some people we know about their exposure as well. And this is how it's doing something wrong. Sorry, I was turning it off on via the button. Sorry. So this is the information, when we get information from individual patients, this is how it works. So, the patient provides consent, completes the questionnaire, sends it to the registry, and the registry sends that questionnaire to Monash University, the Centre for Occupational and Environmental Health, and they follow that up via postal questionnaire and usually telephone to get the detailed history. So they get the questionnaire, and then another centre gets the telephone information, and all of that is fed back to the registry. And I'll show you some of the information from that in a little while. So here I'm going to give you some results from the latest report. So this report was released last year, and it's 2016 data. There'll be another report released in the next 6 months or so. And I should have said that registry has moved from National Cancer Institute, as I mentioned, to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and there's a management committee, and I used to be on the management committee when it was with the New South Wales Institute. Now that it's moved to the AHW, I'm now chair of that committee. So, we had 700 cases reported in 2016, and that's been pretty much the case for several years. And the rate's 2.5 per 100,000. I can't remember what it was in Italy, but perhaps talk about that later on. As has been found elsewhere, higher in men than women. You might remember Dario said the rate was about 2.5 times higher in men than women in Italy, something like that. And in Australia, it's about 4. Males account for about 80% of the cases. Most of the patients are elderly. And so you can see that's almost exactly what Dario just said was the case for Italy. So this is a graph showing age along the x-axis and the number along the y-axis, just to show you the comparison of male to female and showing you the age groups. And this is 64 to 69. So you can see the vast majority of cases are people aged 65 and above. So this is the incidence. The previous one I showed you was just numbers. This one is the incidence. And as is found most of the time, or probably all the time when we look at mesothelioma, the rates increase with age, even up into the 80s. The most common subtype of mesothelioma was the epithelioid, same as was Dario just reported. Most common location was the pleura, by far, mainly right-sided, but clearly not only right-sided. And in the people that we had cause of death from, so we don't have cause of death for everybody, but we have it for the vast majority, the people we do have it from, 90% of them, the main cause of death was the mesothelioma, rather than some other disease. Now here's information over time. Previously I just showed you for 2016. This is information over time. So on the x-axis is the year starting in 1982 on the left, and on the y-axis is the number. And you can see the numbers still going up. The dotted line in the last couple of years is because it takes a few years for the full notifications to come through. So don't look at that yet as a decrease, it's just we haven't got all the notifications yet. So for the years where we would expect to have all the notifications, the rates looks like it's still going up a little bit or just plateauing at just above 700 cases. So that's the number, this is the rate. And there are various arguments to which you would normally focus on, but at least in terms of the rate in Australia, the peak for the rate probably occurred in the early 2000s and clearly is dropping slowly since then. So the numbers are still going up, the rate's coming down though because our population overall has increased. And I should have said, sorry, the top line there is male, the bottom line, the red one, is female, and the orange one in the middle is the combination of the two. So that's in terms of the numbers. That information has come from the registry. And this is information on exposure. So exposure information has been obtained for about 700 people. You notice I said there was about 700 per year. The registry's been operating since halfway through 2010, and so there's probably been, I actually can't remember how many, but 3,000 or 4,000 notifications since then, and we've got information on 700 of those. So it's a minority, and so you need to keep in mind whether these are representative or not. But of those 700, 60% of cases had possible or probable occupational exposure. About a third didn't appear to have had any occupational exposure, so only had non-occupational exposure. 80% or so had possible or probable non-occupational exposure, and about 7% there was no identified asbestos exposure, and I think it probably did occur, but it just wasn't identified. The jobs that had the highest likelihood of exposure in terms of the information provided were construction jobs, and they were referred to earlier in the first presentation today, and electrical and related trades. And the most common circumstances where there appeared to have been exposure in a non-occupational setting was home renovation and car maintenance. Probably not a surprise to most of you. Okay, so in conclusion, originally I didn't have a conclusion slide, but I thought that's a bit odd not to have a conclusion slide. But so here is what I think you can take away from this. We've had active surveillance for mesothelioma in Australia for nearly 40 years, not quite 40 years, and it has highlighted many of the problems in terms of the burden of burden from asbestos exposure. But as Dario mentioned several times, you need to keep in mind it's not just mesothelioma. There's a range of other diseases as well. It's just that meso is the easiest one for us to track in terms of knowing it's come from asbestos. Maintaining the surveillance in a form that I consider useful has been a real challenge. I think we are doing it reasonably well, but I think we need to do it better, but it has been difficult. Getting the exposure information has been particularly challenging, and that's probably the most useful part of it, I think. And it has been difficult. But it has been it and its forerunners have been a very important thing in terms of keeping the problem of asbestos in front of the general public and in front of the government, so that we can get resources that are needed across the country to help in this area. And it has been particularly useful for that. Thank you very much.